Welcome to the Brewing Wellness Podcast, nourishing UFT members, one conversation at a time. Brewing Wellness is a podcast created by the UFT Member Assistance Program to support the mental health and well-being of our members. In order to do the work you do every day and be present for your loved ones, students, and patients, your cup has to be full. Brewing Wellness focuses on mental health and wellness topics that can help us all thrive in our professional and personal lives. We'll be releasing a new episode on the last Monday of each month. Remember to listen to the Brewing Wellness Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And please, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back to the Brewing Wellness Podcast hosted by the UFT Member Assistance Program. I'm Jocelyn Joseph, and I am a licensed mental health counselor with the UFT Member Assistance Program. Today, I'm joined by Gina Maffa, a licensed social worker and mental health educator specializing in grief and loss. In today's episode, we want to talk about a topic that so many of us unfortunately know so well, grief. On top of all of our varying personal losses, we've also experienced numerous collective losses and experienced tremendous collective grief that impacts us emotionally, personally, and sometimes even professionally. Through this conversation with Gina, I'm hoping to get more insight into grief and better understand loss and ways to cope with grief. So, Gina, thank you for joining me. How are you?
Jocelyn, thank you so much for having me here on this nutty New York City day. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you for being here. So we mentioned earlier that you're a licensed social worker and mental health educator, but can you tell us a little bit more about specifically the work that you do?
Sure. Well, my work started out right after September 11th as a trauma therapist. So when I was going into my social work program, it was really following September 11th, and I was really interested in trauma and really interested in the fact that not a lot of people knew about trauma. Mm-hmm. It was really just after that PTSD became kind of a household name. So what I was really trying to do in the early part of my career was to work and educate and treat trauma in all different ways, internationally and here. And what I noticed kind of halfway through is that nobody was ever talking about grief. And so there's a before and an after when we go through really big events in our lives. And nobody really, at that time anyway, spent time honoring what was and looking at the effects that grief has on us. And it's really similar to trauma. So I started to do a lot of work in groups with Holocaust survivors at the 92nd Street Y many years ago. And that is sort of how I got into grief work. And then wherever I've been in my career, which is now a private practice for many years, I was incorporating grief work, whether it was working with addictions, whether it was working with mental health challenges or trauma. It felt to me like one of the things that connected all of the mental health challenges that we have is a sense of loss. And so now in my private practice, and now as I go out into the world and talk about it and teach about it, and talk about the book I wrote on it, it really is just how do we help people to understand what they're going through after loss. And so that's sort of what I'm doing now and how I got into it.
Wow. So you've been doing this work for a while.
20 years.
Yes, 20 years. So we all use the word grief so much and in so many different ways. So what specifically does grief mean in your work? I mean, we're probably going to be using the word a lot today. So what does grief mean in your work?
When I talk about grief, it's really interesting because most people think of grief as death-related losses. And when I talk about it, I see it as a loss of any kind. It could be a breakup. It could be the loss of a relationship. It could be fertility challenges. And so I think the pandemic actually is starting to be one of those education by experience things that we go through where we realized that now so many people were going through loss in the pandemic, whether it was the loss of their home, the loss of safety, health issues. People started to get chronic health issues, so they lost a sense of having a healthy body. And so I think that these are things that all individually need to be grieved and honored and acknowledged, but we don't always do that. And so I say to anybody listening, if you're a teacher, you're in the field of education, we're only trained to really be looking at things in people's families that are a loss of significant people through death. But the truth is that, when a child goes through the divorce of their parents, they're going through grief. And so it's really important to look at all of the ways in which we lose all the time. And I would just assume that everybody at some point in their life has gone through a loss of some kind, maybe without knowing it.
Yeah, so it sounds like to you or in your work, you see grief as more than just death. It's also just loss in general. And so how would you say throughout the past 20 years, how would you say grief has, or your understanding of grief has changed?
My own understanding of grief changed actually after losing my own mother, when I didn't realize, and here I was as a grief therapist for so long, but I never realized that grief was a full body experience. And so the way that it was manifesting for me was I got really sick and wound up in the hospital with pancreatitis and a thyroid problem and, things I still am dealing with. But right after losing my mom, here I was like, I'm a grief therapist. I work with trauma. Like, I'm cool. I have the tools. But the truth is like, I'm not exempt either. None of us are exempt from the effects of grief. And so here I was thinking it was an emotional experience and I could just feel my feelings, which is what people always say. But the truth is that it was manifesting in my body, and that grief in general is more of a physical experience than any of us know. And so that's kind of something that I've been learning along the way. I have a whole chapter in my book that is, called, My Body Was Calling, but I had it on Do Not Disturb, because I didn't have time. Number one, it felt like grieving was a luxury, and any kind of paying attention to my body felt like I just didn't have the time for it. But like most things, we learn the hard way. And it was a really big lesson that I'm grateful that I've learned now, because now at least I can help others through that period.
Yeah, so one, I'm sorry for your loss. And two, it does sound like it helped you, I guess, better understand grief.
For sure.
And so I'm sure you've worked with so many different types of grief. We talked about how it can be anything, right? So what are some of the tools and techniques that you find most effective in helping others manage grief and loss?
I think the first thing that feels really important to me is the understanding of what you're experiencing, right? Like, we're people who look for reference points. Like, how did the person down the street do it? What happened when my friend lost her mom? Or, we tend to just compare the things that we're going through, if we've never been through it before, to other people's stuff. And, one of the things I say when people come to me is like, let's understand what you're going through, not where you think you're doing it wrong. Because by the time people come to me as a therapist, they have felt like they're stuck in some feelings or they're stuck in an experience. But the truth is you're never stuck. It's just that there are things within grief that we don't always understand. And we have to first start with understanding what we're going through. So understanding that it's a full body experience, understanding that it takes endurance, that it's like this marathon, that grief is with us always. It will never go away per se. There's no cure, there's no finish line, there's no 5 stages. And so it's important that people understand that anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, important days that you've shared with somebody, if it's a death-related loss, that will bring up grief again. And so if we know that right off the bat, I think it's going to be important for people to say, okay, so now I know this is with me for a really long time, and it will get messy from time to time. It will change in intensity. But if I know it's here, I'm going to learn how to work with it. And so for me, there's a really big mind-body connection avenue that I like to take, because I believe that grief is in the body. So if we're talking about loss and we're talking about a traumatic loss, just for example, it would be something like maybe EMDR or somatic experiencing, or different types of, mind-body techniques like havening, or art for grief, yoga for grief. There's a lot of different avenues that people can take to get the body involved. But first and foremost, I would always say is like, if you're in fresh grief or you're in this place where you just can't kind of see straight, let's shrink our world down and take it back to basics. Let's just make sure we're drinking enough water, we're getting enough of the right food, we're getting rest, we're moving our body, we're getting sunshine and fresh air, stuff that we take for granted too. Mm-hmm. Even as busy people in the world, like, are we doing these things? I mean, I know for sure I'm not sometimes. And so as a griever, if I have to plan a funeral, if I have to go back to work, if I'm trying to clean out somebody's closet, I'm not thinking about drinking water or eating. I'm going to be thinking about the brain fog. What are the things I have to get done? How do I do it? How do I get through this next hour? And so it's really, really important that we remember our body first and foremost. And so some of the tools really are just that kind of reminder, but also the things that come along with real grief therapy, which is not just writing letters and telling me about all of the, the lost feelings, which are important, but it's really getting your body involved and making sure that we're always paying attention to what our body is telling us.
Yeah, I think that all of those skills sound really important. And another question is, do you feel like there are any, misconceptions about grief therapy? Because you were saying the typical things like writing letters. And do you feel like there are misconceptions out there about what grief therapy will look like?
I think people don't know what grief therapy will look like. And I think it's really hard because as a social worker who went to school 20 years ago, there were no classes on grief. There were no electives even. There was sort of a spirituality in grief and loss class, I believe. But that was really it. And so when I look around today and I see that even more people are not getting grief training, it's sort of a little bit intimidating for a lot of people too. Like, how do we talk about grief? We're not educated on grief even in society, right? Mm-hmm. Like, how many people do you know that get weird around loss? They disappear. We lose our support systems because people are so uncomfortable. And that actually flows over to therapists too, because therapists are human, right? So we're like trained in stuff, but if we're not comfortable with it, we're not going to get trained in it. Mm-hmm. And so I find that even here in New York City, there isn't an overflowing amount of grief-informed therapists. So I would say that there hasn't really been an expectation of what to expect in grief therapy because who knows who's doing it. But I think, it's really individual. It's important to sort of say, where are you at in your journey with grief? Is it fresh? Have you been dealing with this for a year? Is it something that's coming up 20 years from now? And then really kind of tailor what we're doing to that individual person after making them feel safe, because talking about grief is uncomfortable as much as talking about a trauma. So there's a lot that comes into the idea of being grief-informed and trauma-informed when it comes to therapy. I think we toss the words around, but I don't think people really understand the importance of it. So, yeah, I think we start there. We start with safety, and then we go from there. We go with education.
That makes a lot of sense. And then another question is, so we talked about how grief isn't just death. I think that that's a theme here. So do you work differently with those more ambiguous losses than you do with the actual physical death of someone?
I think it's changing now. So I work with a lot of emerging adults who've been coming in recently with friendship loss. And there's a lot of vulnerability and shame there. And so a lot of that is sort of, it's not necessarily all physical, like let's talk about the trauma in your body, but it's sort of let's talk about your history with connections and interpersonal relationships, and let's dig deep on your sense of self and where you are. And so it's really interesting that so many young people have been struggling with authenticity and authentic connection lately. It seems to be a theme across the board, and I'm not really sure what's going on with that, but I think that it's definitely something that needs more attention. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that in terms of non-death losses, right now we're in this uptick of people feeling really lonely and feeling really disconnected. There's a lot more breakups than there have been before. Family breakups, the political climate is a really divisive thing in general, and it has remained so. And so I have a lot of people coming to me with those types of very unique situations of loss and not necessarily knowing what to do with it, because on the outside of their lives, people are sort of saying, well, who cares? You move on. Who cares? You let go. Who cares this? And that's not healing. And that's not really getting to the heart of the matter for anybody. And so nobody really understands how to navigate that kind of loss.
Yeah, and it sounds like the first step to that might be accepting that it is a loss, or accepting that there is grief there, which can be hard because of what we think grief is. And then thinking about our audience, right? Like our educators, is there anything specific to educators that comes up for you when you talk about grief or when you think about grief?
I think that educators are grieving in their own ways also with the change in how the education system is looked at and appreciated and valued. And I think there's grief in that in different ways too. So I just want to acknowledge that and give my appreciation of teachers as a daughter of teachers. And really just feeling like, as the world shifts and becomes more volatile, you have so much of a deeper job as teachers to be able to not just teach a curriculum, and not just teach about safety in the classroom, because America, but, there's also the idea that every single person in your classroom has this history, has this story, perhaps has this trauma, and will go through different types of losses for the most part in ways that either they don't know or understand, or maybe will just come out in their behavior. And kids exhibit grief in such different ways than adults do, and it's so misunderstood, right? Kids aren't going to come out and say, well, I lost my mom and I feel really sad about it. I mean, not usually. Usually it will come out in behavior, and it will come out in different ways where it seems really erratic at times. They'll be fine, and then they'll laugh, and then they'll cry, and then they'll be angry, and that really goes through 18, and so I think it's important to understand specifically how young adults and how children grieve, but also, there's just a lot to look for, even if there isn't a death loss. And I think it makes the job so much harder. And that's why I have so much empathy for where teachers are, and nobody really seeing that you are 7 different job titles all in one day. And it's important to take care of yourselves too, as a sidebar. But yeah, I think that if we were talking specifically about grief, just to say, we're all grieving something, and what may seem like a big loss to you or a big loss to someone else, we judge losses, and we tend to judge each other's experiences as worthy or unworthy. And I just think it's important to note that every loss is valid, whether we think it is or not, and everybody's experience is different and coming from a different history, and it's just important to validate and honor that. We need some more tenderness in the world these days.
Yes, definitely. So also, we know, or I don't know if we mentioned it, but you did you did mention it. You did release a book about grief. So can you tell everybody what it's called?
Absolutely. I wrote a book that just came out a little less than a year ago called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. And it's the modern guide to navigating loss. And I wrote it during the pandemic because I felt like there were so many people calling me, to the point I made earlier. There just weren't enough grief therapists in the world. And I was getting calls from like Kentucky and Missouri and Massachusetts and all over the place. And even in New York, I just am one person with 2 hands. And I was doing all that I could do, but it just wasn't enough. And a lot of my colleagues were also, overscheduled. And I also realized that there's so many people out there that need specific grief-informed therapy and support, but don't have the money or don't have insurance or don't have access to that wherever they may be. And although it's a very small mission, my hope with this book was to provide as close to the grief therapy with me as possible, or close to grief therapy in the therapy room in general as possible, in one little book. And it seems like this huge feat. And I'm not so, I don't have such a big ego to think that my book is the be all end all for grief therapy, but it felt important to me to do something that would provide access for people who may not just have the ability to be in any kind of grief therapy, but want to understand what they're going through and really want to understand what to do next. And it felt important for me to say, okay, I do this work for 20 years I've done this work. And yet I want you to know that, like, all of us fumble with this, that grief is this universal human wound that we're all clumsy and messy with because humanity is messy. And that yet we can get through it together, and that you don't have to go through this loss alone, whatever your loss may be. And so I wrote this book sort of wanting to both teach and educate about the different types of losses that people go through, but to talk about things that come up that you wouldn't think about, like, is my loss a trauma? And if it is, what makes my loss different than other people's losses? Because it will. And what does that look like for me to go forward? How does that make therapy look different for me? And so I talk about that in my book, and I talk about really what happens if you don't have a great relationship with someone who died. That makes it so tricky and complicated, and people judge that, and so how do we navigate all of these little things? How do we go back to work after loss? So many people don't have the luxury of having bereavement leave. It's one of the things that this country is really in need of repair on, one of many things. But, so many people just have no choice but to go right back to work. And it makes grieving, which is so painful in and of itself, a huge luxury. So I think it's just important to touch on all of the things that come up in grief and sort of normalize it and teach people about it, because I think it's one of the things that we just really aren't good at. And we don't know how to support people who are grieving. We don't know how to grieve ourselves. And it's a mess. And it doesn't have to be. So that's sort of the point of my book. And I hope I explained it in a way that makes you want to go out and look at it at your library or buy it, whatever it may be, because there's a lot of heart in there too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I have it. I have your book. I do.
I didn't know that.
I do.
Oh, I brought you a copy too.
Oh, well, we
We'll
could use
leave
it.
for Jess.
Yes. But yeah, so it sounds like your book it sounds like it can help anyone who's dealing with any type of loss and in any type of way, which is super, super important.
Thank you. I do have to shout out that it is always in the top 5 of pet loss on Amazon.
Wow.
And yet I didn't write the book specifically for pet loss. And so it's really interesting that it is always, and I don't have any say in what Amazon classifies my book as, but it's in pet loss. And so it's really interesting. That's sort of the one thing that I would really want people to reach out to me and say, like, if you've lost a pet and you read it, because pet loss is something that we also don't talk enough about, and you don't get any bereavement days for when your dog dies or your cat dies. It's like, it's really hard, but interestingly, yeah, it's one of the categories on Amazon, and I've gotten some slack for that, because people are like, this is not a specific pet loss book and on Amazon in the reviews, and I'm like, I promise I didn't put it there. But I do think that, when your heart hurts and you've lost, your heart hurts and you've lost. And I think it's applicable across the board. So that's my hope.
Yeah. And do you have any final words for anyone listening about grief, about loss, about anything that we've talked about today?
Do I have final words? I never have final words. No, I'm really grateful to be here with you. I love the work that you do. This is a gold standard of an organization. I mean, this is so important. And I think that grief in general just needs to be talked about, whether it's in class or in any kind of curriculum whatsoever, or a health class, like something that it just needs to be a little bit more present. Because not that I want to give teachers any more work or the social workers in school, but I do think that if we all just could understand that grief and all of the myths associated with it, like the 5 stages of grief, or that it's linear and that you'll get through it and move on. I think if we just understood what we were going through a lot more, I think that it would make the landing a little bit softer for people. And I think we would be able to be just there for each other more in ways that we aren't able to right now. So that's my hope. My hope is that grief will be something that we can talk about as openly and honestly as we do about anxiety.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. I think grief education is definitely needed. And thank you for being here with me.
I'm so happy to be here with you, and I appreciate you doing this with me today.
I appreciate you being here.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brewing Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the UFT Member Assistance Program to support the mental health and well-being of our members. If you are a UFT member, the Member Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or by emailing mapinfo@uft.org. And once again, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for listening.